On the night of July 12, 1943, the Pacific waters churned black as ink. Lieutenant Commander John Benjamin Fellows stood on the bridge of USS Gwin, ninth in a line of 13 Allied ships. As his destroyer cut through the humid darkness, her crew endured stifling heat below deck, searching for fleeting breezes above. None of them knew these would be their final hours aboard the ship they called home. Unbeknownst to them, just as the ships passed through the waters of Kula Gulf, a powerful Japanese force lay in wait. 4 transports, escorted by a light cruiser and 5 destroyers, armed with the dreaded long-lance torpedoes, against which even the most seasoned crew stood little chance. USS Gwin steamed steadily toward her rendezvous with destiny. The First Battle of Guadalcanal. After the victory at Midway in the late spring of 1942, the Solomon Islands became the next crucial battleground in the Pacific. Control over these areas meant dominating key supply routes and setting the stage for the Allies for General MacArthur's push north. For Japan, losing the Solomons meant a direct path for the Allies toward their beloved homeland. On August 7th, nearly 20,000 United States Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal and Tulagi, seizing a Japanese airfield they soon renamed Henderson Field. Located only 650 miles from Japan's stronghold at Rabaul, the airfield's capture prompted the Empire to retaliate with covert nighttime supply runs down the slot, a narrow channel the Americans dubbed the Tokyo Express. To defend Henderson Field, Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's Task Force 67-4 moved to intercept the Japanese supply lines. In response, Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe, under orders from Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, advanced to protect a landing force of 12,000 troops, setting the stage for the first naval battle of Guadalcanal. At 1 a.m. on November 13th, Abe's task force entered Iron Bottom Sound. After American radar detected their approach, a fierce, hour-long close-range battle erupted, with both sides exchanging relentless fire. The toll on the U.S. Navy was devastating. USS Atlanta and USS San Francisco took heavy hits, losing Captain Casson Young and Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, while 2 light cruisers, Atlanta and Juno, were gone, along with countless men. And though Abe's forces ultimately withdrew, intelligence soon reported that Japan had not given up its attempts to knock out Henderson Field and was already sending another force south. Led by Admiral Nobutake Kondo aboard the battleship Kirishima, this fleet included 5 heavy cruisers, Maya, Atago, Suzuya, Takao, and Kunigasa, along with 2 light cruisers and an escort of 11 destroyers and 23 troop transports. Once again, this force outnumbered anything the U.S. Navy could assemble. With Callahan's task force now decimated, the fate of Henderson Field now rested with Task Force 64, commanded by Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, Jr., and consisting of the battleships USS Washington and South Dakota, along with 4 destroyers, Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwin. Each ship was about to be thrown into the fight of their lives. USS Gwin. USS Gwin, a Gleaves-class destroyer, was the 3rd ship of the United States Navy to be named after American Civil War Lieutenant Commander William Gwin. Commissioned in January 1941, like all of her sister ships, she was 348 feet long, displaced 1,630 tons standard, and could carry about 11 officers and 201 enlisted personnel. She was also very well armed, with 5 Mark 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 5 40mm twin anti-aircraft guns, and 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, complemented by a range of 6,500 nautical miles and a top speed of more than 37 knots. But Gwyn's most powerful asset was her captain, John Fellows. A seasoned and skilled commander, he'd worked his way up through the ranks of the destroyer, starting as an engineering officer in 1940 and advancing to executive officer, finally taking the helm as commanding officer in early 1942. Just as the war intensified, Gwin joined the Doolittle raid in April 1942, escorting USS Hornet for the air attack on Tokyo. In May 1942, the destroyer sailed with Marines to reinforce Midway, but arrived too late for the main battle. Instead, she aided the damaged USS Yorktown, rescuing 102 crew members, after the tragic loss of USS Hammond, beginning her reputation for heroic rescues. During the First Battle of Guadalcanal, USS Gwin was stationed at Espiritu Santo, delivering supplies and anti-aircraft support to the Marines defending Henderson Field. Although essential to the mission, she had yet to fire her guns in direct combat. This was all about to change. Night 1. On the night of November 13th, 1942, Admiral Lee's task group clashed with Admiral Kondo's force. In the chaotic darkness, communication failures and command blunders allowed the Japanese to initially gain the upper hand, igniting what would become the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, a fight just as fierce as the one that preceded it. Two of the Japanese cruisers, Maya and Suzuya, slipped close enough to Henderson Field to unleash nearly 1,000 shells, destroying aircraft, ripping through structures, and leaving wreckage in their wake. In response, the Americans struck back with everything they had, aided by aircraft from USS Enterprise and Henderson Field. Near Cape Esperance, the Japanese battleship Hiei became the primary target, taking repeated hits from air attacks until she was left a burning hulk, eventually sinking to the bottom of the ocean in the face of the barrage. By morning, when the final tally was made, the Japanese had lost one battleship, Hiei, one cruiser, Kinugasa, 17 aircraft, and 8 transports. However, even as their damaged vessels retreated, the Imperial Navy was still far from done. They would strike again that night. And this time, Gwin and her men would be right in the center of the action. On the eve of November 15th, Gwin and her sister destroyers, Walk, Benham, and Preston, led the American column in a hunt towards the Japanese fleet spotted off Savo Island. At midnight, her lookouts caught sight of 2 cruisers in the distance. Though their shapes were barely visible at 14,000 yards, the Americans readied their guns, and at 12:19 a.m., South Dakota broke the silence with thunderous blasts, and the rest of the fleet followed. Ordered to illuminate the enemy, Gwin fired 2 brilliant star shells into the night sky, momentarily lighting the cruisers and revealing their positions. She then fired 2 rounds of anti-aircraft salvos, knowing the range was too far to cause real damage, but hoping to distract and unsettle the enemy ships. As the battle intensified, Gwin and the other 3 destroyers locked themselves in a fierce gunfight with the light cruiser Nagara and the Japanese destroyers Ayanami and Uranami. Just 27 minutes into the fight, Captain Fellows noted in the ship's log that one of the Japanese cruisers to starboard was ablaze, while the others seemed to retreat. For the Americans, Walk was burning and had to pull out of formation, while Benham and Preston continued firing on targets, the ships cleverly masked by Savo Island shadows. As Gwyn's rounds found their mark toward Ayanami, reducing her strength to a single gun, a Japanese cruiser zeroed in on the American destroyer, sending a 4.7-inch shell into her forward starboard engine room, filling her with steam and chaos. 300 yards ahead, Preston erupted in flames, the blast rocking Gwyn's hull and nearly throwing men from their stations. The strike from Ayanami claimed 6 men near Gwyn's control station, and her engine room filled with scalding steam, forcing crewmen to flee their posts. Within seconds, smoke poured from her wounds, and her lighting flickered out. Yet as the emergency lights turned on, her gun stayed steady and defiant. USS Gwin was still in the fight. Hell breaks loose. Sensing danger, Commander Fellows acted fast, gripping the helm and steering his ship into a sharp turn to avoid the burning Preston. Just after they cleared their sister destroyer, her depth charges detonated. The sheer blast shook Gwin violently and jolted the captain and his crew. Before the crew could even catch their breath, a shell tore a 2-foot hole in her starboard side, ripping into 2 600-pound depth charges on deck and splitting them open. Miraculously, they didn't explode. USS Gwin continued to fire into the dark, doing her best to fire at the faint flashes of enemy ships hidden in the shadows, using guns 1, 2, and 5. One of the other American battleships destroyed the cruiser that had been attacking them from the port side. But the chaos was still mounting as a torpedo whizzed past Gwyn's stern, barely missing her. However, destroyer Benham was not as lucky, and vanished from the formation, lost amid the fight. Believing the Americans were finished, Kondo pulled back, ready for a final strike on Henderson Field. Just then, Japanese lookouts spotted Washington and South Dakota looming in the dark. Torpedoes streaked toward the Americans, who answered with thunderous gunfire. Under a powerful barrage, Kirishima, Kondo's flagship, capsized with nearly 200 sailors, but not before the admiral escaped in another ship. As the sun rose, the battlefield lay silent and littered with burning wreckage. Though battered and down to only one engine, Gwin was the least damaged among the destroyers. After a failed attempt to tow the beleaguered Benham to safety, Commander Fellows navigated his beloved destroyers more than 5,000 miles to Mare Island for repairs, where he was awarded the Navy Cross. Despite her starring role in securing Henderson Field, marking a turning point in the Pacific, the journey of USS Gwin was far from over. Back in action. After heavy repairs in the spring of 1943, Gwin returned to the Pacific, patrolling New Georgia's coastline with Task Unit 3283, preparing for the Allied push on Rendezvous Island. On June 29th, Gwin joined a screening unit for Operation Cartwheel, providing cover fire as U.S. troops landed. The fierce Japanese shore batteries struck back, causing a few casualties, but by afternoon, the destroyer's gunners downed 3 enemy bombers, helping secure the beachhead. With Rendezvous secured, Gwin joined yet another task group to intercept Japanese reinforcements in Kula Gulf. Early on July 5th, the Japanese struck first, sinking USS Strong, with Fellows' crew rescuing 5 survivors before returning to the station. That night, the Battle of Kula Gulf erupted, and within minutes, American fire sank the destroyer Niizuki. Still, the Japanese countered, this time focusing all their rage and might onto the light cruiser USS Helena. Before the heavily beleaguered Helena slipped beneath the waves by morning, Gwin and Woodworth returned to the battle site to rescue 87 sailors from the oil-soaked waters. Days later, the sunk vessel's skipper, Captain Charles P. Cecil, sent a message to Captain Fellows expressing deep gratitude, quote, "The personnel of the USS Helena, whom you helped so much, wish you to know that we shall remember your ship and her personnel with all the gratitude of which we are capable as long as we live. You may rest assured that everyone on the beach that morning offered up at least a silent prayer when the Gwin lay to, waiting for our boats. There are no words to describe the weight which was lifted from our hearts. The efficiency with which we were cared for on board was only equaled by your kindness." Ready for more. After months of endless action, USS Gwin was battle-worn, yet still ready for the fight. With Allied forces deeper and deeper forward in the Pacific, on July 11th, she joined Task Group 36-1, made up of her and 9 other destroyers, alongside the cruisers Honolulu, St. Louis, and the New Zealand cruiser Lender, under the command of Rear Admiral Walton L. Ainsworth. Past midnight on the 13th, Lieutenant Commander Fellows Gwin was 9th in the line of 13 ships as the task force sailed into Kula Gulf, with the mission to protect the Allied amphibious landings made a few days earlier on New Georgia's northern shore and support against Japanese reinforcements gathering at Kolombangara, a key staging ground in the Solomons. That same night, 4 transports, escorted by the light cruiser Jinsu, and 5 destroyers carried over 1,000 Japanese troops down the slot toward Vila on Kolombangara. Ainsworth initially believed he'd achieved surprise, but unbeknownst to him, Vice Admiral Shinji Izaki's convoy was fully aware of the Americans' approach. The Battle of Kolombangara. Still weaving through the dark, inky night, the American destroyers thrust at their Japanese counterparts with torpedoes and 5-inch gunfire. This time, Destroyer Gwin was in the center of the action, just ahead of Honolulu. By then, 4 Japanese destroyers were lying in wait, timing their move until Ainsworth's formation began to turn. Then they launched 31 long-lance torpedoes at the American ships in a well-coordinated strike. And as Honolulu, St. Louis, and Gwin shifted to bring their main guns to bear, they unknowingly sailed directly into the enemy's path. And while both cruisers received damaging hits but survived, the Gleaves-class destroyer would not be as lucky. Just after 2 a.m., Commander Fellows made a hard right to avoid a torpedo headed towards them, But minutes later, a long lance hit her port quarter. As jagged pieces of her blew dozens of feet into the air, her steering gear, engine room, and all radio transmitters were knocked out. Despite the devastating explosion, a firefighting team attempted to control the flames, working under intense heat and thick smoke. After sustaining serious damage, the 3 Allied cruisers, along with their escorts, Buchanan and Woodworth, began a strategic withdrawal to avoid further losses, leaving Gwin, now struggling to stay afloat, isolated in the dark waters. Only destroyer Ralph Talbot stayed behind to aid the battered destroyer and her crew. The vessel's struggle to save the listing, burning, and immobilized Gwin stretched well into the afternoon. However, recognizing it was a losing battle, Skipper Fellows had no choice but to give the order to abandon the ship. At 9:30 a.m., aboard Ralph Talbot, Fellows and his men watched with heavy hearts and tears in their eyes as their beloved Gwin was scuttled, slipping beneath the Pacific in mere seconds, taking with her the bodies of 2 officers and 59 sailors. The end of Gwin. The Battle of Kolombangara came at a very high cost: 89 American lives, nearly all of them Gwin sailors. Although the Japanese lost Jinsu and Admiral Izaki, their remaining destroyers escaped, eventually landing 1,200 troops at Bila. After the tragic end of the heroic USS Gwin, Admiral Ainsworth later sent the following message to Fellows, quote, "My heart is very full over the loss of our Gwin after her gallant fight against terrible odds, but again you have evened the score by sinking 4 to 6 Jap ships. Once more, I desire to express my unbounded appreciation and respect for the fighting ability of every officer and man in this force." For his unmatched leadership, which was crucial to sinking several Japanese vessels during the grueling 7-hour ordeal, Commander John B. Fellows was awarded the Silver Star. He would never again command in battle, instead taking charge of the newly commissioned USS Twiggs training ship. The Second Battle of Guadalcanal crushed Japan's ambitions of retaking the area and ended the constant threat on Henderson Field. After these endless months of battle, the waters around the island finally lay firmly in American hands. During this period, time and again, the destroyer USS Gwin served as a lifeline for others, rescuing crews, shielding troops, and covering landings. Yet in her final moments, she could not save herself. According to one of her crewmen, quote, "She was a great ship, but we knew she'd been living on borrowed time. I guess all of us lived on that kind of time in the Solomons."